Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
How are ya?
Hey, how are you?
Good, thanks.
Hi.
Thanks for doing this again.
Welcome, everybody. Good to see y'all. Nice sunny day. So hopefully this afternoon you get a chance to go outside and join the world. We have a couple of exciting programs coming up in June. On the 2nd, we have Looking Back, Looking Forward, the Black-Jewish relationship, which is a great subject for our speaker, Rabbi Judy Schindler, who I'm sure most of you know, and topic close to her heart, and it should be really fascinating. Hope to see you there. And then we will close the spring with our traditional musical closing. And on the 16th, we'll have jazz with Noel Freeline. He is a great pianist, a great arranger. We've had the pleasure, Sandy and I, of belonging to the Beckler Jazz Affinity Group for a decade now. And he's in the Ziad quartet that plays in that. But he also, he's traveled with Maria Howland and backed her up, if you know who she is. She's originally from Charlotte, but she's a very, very, very well-known jazz singer from around the country. And he's a great teacher. We heard him at the Mint Museum a couple of years back with some of the students, and it was fabulous. So we'll end on that note today, and I'll turn it over to Harry Cronson in a few moments to give you an in-depth introduction. But Dr. Joshua Furman will join us in what is and is not Southern about Texas Jews. And I'm really looking forward to this because my father's mother's family came to Texas in 1840 and stayed there through the 19th century until my grandmother married a Yankee and moved up to Providence, Rhode Island. And eventually her folks, when they got old, moved up and joined them. So I'm really interested to hear about this. So welcome to everybody. Hope everybody is feeling well and getting out and about more and more. And let me turn this over to Harry. And here's Harry Cronson to introduce Dr. Furman.
Hi. We're excited to have Dr. Joshua Furman with us today to learn about Texas Jewry. He's the founder and the curator of the Houston Jewish History Archive at Rice University, where he also serves as a lecturer in the program in Jewish Studies. Dr. Furman specializes in American Jewish social and cultural history with research interest in suburbanization, education, and family life since World War II. He's currently working on a book project about the history of the Houston Jewish community. Dr. Furman?
Okay, everybody, good morning. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Harry for reaching out with an invitation to speak to your group, and Tracy for help with tech support. It's really exciting to be with the SPICE group. What does SPICE stand for, by the way? You're all muted. Those of you who are trying to
Special programs of interest and concern to elders.
Oh yeah, that works.
Yeah,
that's really good.
And if you think of something better, just let us know.
No, I'm not gonna think of anything better. I am a lover of clever acronyms. That's a good one. That's really special. So thank you for that introduction. I am the founder and curator of the Houston Jewish History Archive at Rice University here. And I'm gonna start my remarks today just by speaking briefly about my work with the archive and how it got started. And then we're gonna spend the bulk of our time today thinking about the place of Texas in Southern history and culture, and the place of Texas Jews in the history of Jewish life in the South. And what I'll be interested to hear from you all is the places where you see parallels between Texas Jewry and Jewry in the Carolinas. And I suspect that we'll find a lot. but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that. I'm also going to try to pause about every 10 minutes or so to take questions. And we've all had, too much practice by now doing these Zoom sessions. So as I'm moving along, if you have a comment or a question or idea and you want to type it into the chat window, I'll try to keep an eye on the chat forum and reply to questions and comments every few minutes or so. So with that in mind, why don't we go ahead and jump in and get started? And as promised, I'm going to just start by briefly talking about the scope of my work. So the Houston Jewish History Archive was established at Rice in 2018, and it really grew out of the devastating after effects of Hurricane Harvey. I mean, here in Texas, and I'm sure for you all in North Carolina, unfortunately, severe weather is a fact of life, and is becoming more of a regularity, unfortunately, with each passing year. But we had never seen, even though Houston is prone to chronic flooding, we had never seen anything like Hurricane Harvey before, which in August of 2017 dumped 51 inches of rain on our city in the span of 3 days. It's just an unbelievable amount. And it did unprecedented damage, in particular to the southwestern quadrant of Houston, which is where the city's Jewish community is concentrated. And a number of synagogues and Jewish institutions flooded. Our Jewish community center, the entire lower level of the building was underwater. Congregation Beth Yeshurun, seen here on your screen, is the largest conservative synagogue in the United States, and it flooded. And it became very clear to me that there was nobody on the ground here in the city who was prepared to undertake the work of going around to flooded institutions and flooded homes to try to salvage and collect and restore historical photographs and documents and other things that had been damaged and endangered by the floodwaters. So this is just one small part of a very large emergency recovery effort that we underwent in the weeks after the hurricane. And we actually managed to save a great deal of the congregation's historical material, but not all of it. And here you can see, unfortunately, the lasting damage that floodwaters do to photographs. It's really devastating and heartbreaking. So with that, we decided that something needed to be done here on the ground to make sure that the legacy of our city's Jewish community would never be lost to another flood or natural disaster. So we created this archive in partnership with Rice, where I work and teach. And our mission is to collect, preserve, and make accessible the documents, photographs, artifacts, and memories via oral history that tell the story of Jewish life in Greater Houston and South Texas. This is a partnership between the program in Jewish Studies and the Woodson Research Center and Fondren Library, which is like our special collections division. And increasingly, even though our name is the Houston Jewish History Archive, we've begun branching out and collecting material not just from the Houston metro area, but really from all across South Texas, because we find, and I'm sure the story is true also in North Carolina, that the history of Jewish life in our region can't be told without including the stories of all the small towns where Jewish immigrants and their families came to settle in the mid-19th century and later, many of them opening, small retail stores, dry goods stores, clothing stores, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that is a history that is disappearing with each passing year. And so we believe it's very important that we not just focus our efforts on Houston, but also the entire region at large. What do we do here at the archive? We collect documents, photographs, artifacts, audio recordings, video recordings. We digitize them as much as we can because we know that we're telling the story of a community that's living in a flood-prone area. And so Ordinarily, it would be important to digitize this material, but all the more so for us, because of our situation. In order to ensure the longevity of these materials, we need to try to digitize as much of them as possible. During the pandemic, we launched an oral history initiative. Everybody was stuck at home, so we had a captive audience, and we used Zoom to record oral histories with Jewish Texans from multi-generational families, as well as with community leaders talking about their experiences during the pandemic. We sponsor exhibits here in Texas, lectures and public programs, and we have a growing social media presence, a website, and we're on Facebook and Instagram as well. The things that we collect, it has to be related to the Texas Jewish experience. So we don't just collect old Jewish books for the sake of collecting old Jewish books, but we have a pretty diverse collection of materials. Scrapbooks, family photographs, diaries, relics from Jewish life cycle moments, weddings, bar and bat mitzvahs, confirmations, funerals, so on and so forth. We have institutional records, business records, Jewish military veteran records, and so on and so forth. I'm going to just skip over this slide and kind of get to the promised title of my presentation. But if you have a question about the archive, how it got started, I'll be happy to address that maybe toward the end in the formal Q&A section of the presentation. So let's talk about Texas for a minute. I don't know how many of you have been to Texas or familiar with Texas. Texas is, in a lot of ways, not only a formerly independent country, right, the Republic of Texas, which lasted from 1836 to 1845, but in some ways it still today is two countries. And I like to think of I-35, which you can see bisects the state into two unequal portions, as a really important cultural and geographical dividing line. And I'll explain what I mean. So if you look to the right of I-35, you'll notice a couple of things. First of all, that is where most of the major cities in the state are located. Houston, San Antonio, Dallas, Austin is sort of right on that line as well. So for the most part, that's where the people live in the state. And it's also, East Texas is the part of Texas that looks most like the rest of what we think of as the South. Cotton country, plantations. And certainly, you know, when we think about the history of Jim Crow and the history of segregation in the United States, and I heard that you're going to have a speaker coming in a few weeks to talk about the history of Black-Jewish relations, a really important topic, and one that I also teach about here at Rice University. So the eastern section of Texas resembles Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, and perhaps even the Carolinas to some respect, in sharing that history of the state. Houston, before Houston was the oil and energy capital of the United States, was a cotton capital, right? It's being, you know, with the Houston Ship Channel and being a railroad hub, cotton was very important to Houston's early development. Not so well known today because everyone associates Houston with oil and with NASA. But you can't tell the history of this city without talking about the history of the cotton industry and the slave labor that made that possible. But if you look on the other side of I-35, it's almost like you've stepped into a different world. This is what we think of as the West, right? The frontier. This is cattle and cowboy country. This is, you know, the idea of Texas as the frontier, a big open land ripe for settlement, a place to start over and, you know, reinvent yourself. Mountains. It's very different geographically, as well as culturally. And if you think about, you know, the most iconic parts of Texas and Texan culture today, many of the signposts that you hit upon feel more Western than Southern, probably, right? Think about the rodeo, cowboy hats, the Texas Rangers, you know, Spindletop and the oil boom. It has a little bit of a different feel than things that we think of as traditionally Southern. So what separates Texas from the rest of the South, if anything? And maybe the answer is that there's nothing different or distinctive. I think there are a few answers to this, with the exception of Florida, which has a lot in common with Texas, I think, in a lot of ways. One of the things that separates Texas from the rest of the South would be the enduring influence of Spanish and Mexican culture on Texas life, still today, depending on where you are in the state. And I actually am a native Texan. I didn't grow up in Houston, but I grew up in San Antonio, which is about 200 miles to the west of Houston, and is a deeply Hispanic city, as many other cities in Texas have a deep and enduring Hispanic influence. Right? This makes Texas different from some of our neighbors, I think, in a lot of important ways. A lot of the iconic Texan foods that we associate with, tacos, chili, and barbecue, are all Spanish and Mexican in their origin. Mexican holidays are part of the local cultural calendar. We celebrate Cinco de Mayo. We celebrate Dia de los Muertos to a large extent. You go to the grocery store and you'll see, displays for these things. And even, right, the rodeo, probably our most iconic event here in Texas, is Spanish in origin. So that's Texas. Texas is neither completely Southern nor completely Western. It's neither, it's both. And people continue to argue about the place of Texas in the South and in the West. But this is a Jewish group. I'm someone who studies Southern Jewish history and Texas Jewish history. Let's talk now about the Texas Jewish experience, right? Are Jewish Texans Southerners, or are they something else entirely? And I thought, it would be interesting to think about Texas Jewish history through the lens of Southern Jewish history. I happen to be on the board of an organization called the Southern Jewish Historical Society. You may have heard of this group. If you enjoy this lecture, I would suggest seeking out the Southern Jewish Historical Society for more kinds of programming like this. The society, this is a free plug for them. They publish an annual journal with scholarly essays and articles and book reviews on Southern Jewish history. And they also sponsor an annual conference, which this year is going to be held in person in Charleston. So I don't know how far it is, Charlotte to Charleston, but it's a conference that is open to the general public. You have to be a member of the society, but you are able to participate and come and sit and learn and dine with professors and genealogists and lay people who happen to just be Southern Jewish history groupies, and it's a really wonderful experience. So the exercise here is to think about ways in which the historical experience of Jews in Texas mirrors larger themes in the history of the Jewish South. And again, I'm wondering, as we move through these, I would love to hear your comments and ideas about how it echoes and reflects the history as you know it of Jews in Charlotte and Jews in the Carolinas. So the first theme that I want to discuss with you is the idea of migration to a land of opportunity. This idea that not just America, but the South in particular, offered Jews a particular kind of haven and refuge. And the remarks that I'm about to show you were written by a man named Louis Levy, one of the earliest Jewish Houstonians. And you can see here he died very early on in the Civil War, not because of the Civil War, though. And he wrote this editorial in a national American Jewish newspaper called the Asmonean. And here's what he said. In our own state, meaning Texas, thousands of acres of land can be bought within the settled portions of the state for the small sum of from 25 cents to $1 per acre. Good, arable, fertile land where a man can make his living to his liking, and more independent than the autocrat of Russia or the emperor of Austria themselves. Indeed, I would not exchange my 15-acre lot with the house on it and the garden around it, which I possess near the city of Houston, for all thrones and hereditary dominions of both those noted persons. For we will see if we live, who will have a shelter of their own 15 years from now. And he goes on to express a wish that if only they could convince more European Jews to come to Texas, there they would find not only economic opportunity, but they would find civil liberties, they would find freedom from oppression and violence. And I am sure that others who came to the South in the second half of the 19th century and early decades of the 20th century felt similarly, but this is an example of this having to do with Texas. One more really interesting entry in this genre of literature of Texas as a kind of land of opportunity actually came to us at the Houston Jewish History Archive about a year and a half ago before the pandemic started. This is a pamphlet that was printed, it was published in Eastern Europe, so it's in Yiddish, and it's called Major News About Immigration to Galveston in the state of Texas, and it's from 1907. And it relates just briefly to something called the Galveston movement, which was an organized effort to get Jews out of Eastern Europe and bring them into America, not through Ellis Island in New York, but through the port of Galveston. And there from Galveston to disperse them throughout the South and Midwest. Not too many of them ended up in the Carolinas. Most of them ended up, believe it or not, in the Midwest, in places like Kansas City, Minneapolis, St. Paul, other destinations in Iowa and Colorado, and many of them in Texas. And this is what the inside of the pamphlet looks like. So it's a snapshot of Texas and the Texas Jewish community in Yiddish in 1907, which is really interesting. And here's how Texas is described. The state of Texas is the largest of all the United States. It occupies some 260,000 English square miles and is larger, for example, than all of France. Its soil is especially fertile for grazing cattle and cotton plants. Except for its southern section, its climate is good for your health. I have to chuckle because, of course, Houston is in southeast Texas and it's, brutally humid for 2/3 of the year. So that one always kind of makes me smile. Except for its southern section, its climate is good for your health, especially in the winter months. I'm going to skip down a little bit, but you can read on your screen. Compared to its huge area of territory, its population is very small. The state still has lots of empty space for new immigrants. And one of the interesting ideas in this pamphlet is that New York is no longer a good place for Jews to immigrate to in 1907 because it's too crowded, the sweatshops are bad. But if you come to Texas and some of these other states in the South and Midwest, you'll get a better, more higher paying job. The people are friendly to Jews, and it's a good place for you to find economic opportunity. So again, this idea that the Southern United States offered a particularly good refuge for European Jews, perhaps even, they argued, better than New York City and the East Coast could hope to provide. I'm going to step out of the presentation just for a second because I know that there are 2 comments in the chat window. And it's always fun to discover when folks have a personal connection, in one way or another to the material. So Dick and Janice write, we belonged to Beth Yeshurun in the early 1970s. That's great. Beth Yeshurun is the conservative synagogue that I profiled a few minutes ago. We actually have digitized a lot of material from Beth Yeshurun from that period. Dick and Janice, you might enjoy, if you remember Rabbi William Malev, you can listen to a few of his sermons that we've digitized. And if you write to me, I can share that information with you. And then Linda says that her late husband's grandfather came to the United States through Galveston. That's wonderful. In the period that I was just speaking about, around 9,000, fewer than 10,000, closer to 9,000 Jews came through Galveston in the years before World War I. But of course, people earlier than that were immigrating through Galveston as well. Oh, and Rabbi Siegel was from Jan's hometown. This is fun. It's always fun, as you said, to play Jewish geography. And Bob writes that his mother's family came to Texas through Galveston in 1842, which is really early. And they settled in Belton, right? You remember where I-35 was. They were just south of Austin, and they were cotton brokers. That is really, really fabulous. I think if anybody has, photographs or records from that time, Bob, we'd love to look at them. So another theme that resonates in Texas Jewish history and has parallels in broader comparative perspective is what I call the rise of the retail giants. The idea that Jewish immigrants came to the South at the same time that other non-Jewish European immigrants were arriving here. And in Texas, we had an especially large influx of German and Czech immigrants. Kind of a crude way of putting it, but the Germans and the Czechs came to Texas to farm. And if you get in the car and you drive out I-10, you'll come across a lot of towns with German names. New Braunfels, for example. There is a Weimar, Texas, right? If you're familiar with the Weimar Republic that preceded Hitler's rise to power. So there are a lot of towns with German and Czech names. So those folks came to Texas to farm in the 19th century. Jews came to Texas to sell them things, right? First as peddlers and pushcart sellers, and then those who became successful opened some of the most famous retail establishments in American history, from Sakowitz to Neiman Marcus to Zales Jewelers, and the list goes really on and on and on and on. And one of the things that we do at the archive is to collect information about significant Jewish-owned businesses in Houston and South Texas. These names won't be meaningful to you, most likely. Star Furniture being a major Jewish-owned furniture company here in Texas, and Weingarten's being a Jewish-owned grocery store chain. But I'm sure that there are parallels in the Carolina Jewish story as well. So another theme that rings true both for Texas Jewish history and for Southern Jewish history in particular are the ways in which Jews adapt to local culture and customs as a means of fitting in, as a means of becoming Texan or becoming Southern, whatever that means. And this phenomenon takes on multiple forms, but probably the most prominent and the most colorful way that we can study this phenomenon of cultural adaptation is through food. One of the other courses I teach here at Rice is a course on Jewish food, and we do a unit on Southern Jewish food, which is its own, it's a subject unto itself. And probably the world's leading expert in the field of Southern Jewish food, Marcy Cohen-Ferris, teaches or has taught at UNC in Chapel Hill for decades and has written a lot of really great books on the topic. Maybe you know Marcy already. So the earliest published Texas Jewish cookbook that I know of is this one you see here on your screen, which was published by the Young Ladies Sewing Circle of Temple Beth Israel, which is the oldest Jewish house of worship in the state of Texas, based right here in Houston. Originally, Beth Israel was Orthodox, but within 15, 20 years of its founding, it had adopted many of the practices of the newly emergent Reform movement. And among those is the doing away with of the traditional dietary laws. And so this Jewish cookbook, as much as it is a Jewish cookbook and has recipes for Passover and some of the Jewish holidays, also has plenty of recipes for non-kosher dishes, including this one you can see for how to cook and serve a possum dinner, which is surprising to find in a Jewish cookbook, or perhaps not surprising, right? Possum dinners being something of a Texas tradition at the time. If you're going to write a cookbook in Texas, whether it's a Jewish one or a not Jewish one, you got to have a recipe for possum in there. So there is, in fact, a recipe for possum in this early Houston Jewish cookbook. Another example of this that we have in the archive is a recipe collection that was put together by the Galveston chapter of the National Council for Jewish Women. And you can see here it dates to December 1950. So this is, another way in which, when in Texas, you try to adapt to the local cuisine. So this is a recipe for guacamole. And there are a few things that I love about this recipe for guacamole from 1950. First and foremost, I love the dancing avocados wearing sombreros, right? That's a beautiful touch. But look at the recipe carefully, right? Not only does it give you the ingredients, how to make it, but also they have to explain, right, what guacamole is and what you're supposed to do with it, right? Use it as a cocktail spread. It's delicious if you dip Fritos in it, and you can say, right? Because we have to learn what guacamole is. And it even has an explanation, avocado cocktail dip. Today in 2021, guacamole is ubiquitous, right? You can go anywhere and you can probably walk into a Costco in Idaho and find guacamole on the shelf. But in 1950, this is a way for Galveston Jewish women to introduce and adopt Tex-Mex cuisine, right? And to put it in a Jewish cookbook, I think is really interesting and an important move. Today, here in Texas, the annual Kosher Chili Cookoff is yet another example of this blending of Texan and Jewish cultures, that not only do Jews enjoy chili just as much as everybody else, but they make it kosher so that everybody in the community can enjoy it. And on a final note on this theme, food is a very important force, as we all know, for bringing communities together. And for many, many years in Wharton, Texas, which is about 60 miles from Houston, there was a small but very vibrant Jewish community, and their big annual event was a fundraiser barbecue that brought Jews and Gentiles together, and people would drive in from surrounding towns for this barbecue. People who grew up there, the community has died out and disappeared. But the T-shirt, the memento T-shirt, and the stories and photographs of the barbecue remain. So food is a very important theme in Texas Jewish history and in Southern Jewish history as well. Another one that becomes very important is the presence of Jews in Texas politics. One of the things that I think separates Texas Jewish history and Southern Jewish history from American Jewish history writ large is that for a number of reasons, you find Jewish mayors and Jewish city councilmen and Jewish governors much earlier in the Southern United States and the Western United States than you do back in the East Coast. And to some extent, that is a testament to the openness of the South to the presence of Jews and what they could contribute both economically and in terms of political leadership. It's not to say that anti-Semitism did not exist in the South. It certainly did. The Klan was certainly very active throughout the South at times, and certainly very popular, and certainly not without political influence. But Jews have been able to, almost from the very beginning, to serve in positions of political influence, whether we're talking about Babe Schwartz, who was a state senator from Galveston for many decades, Joe Strauss, a Jewish Republican Speaker of the Texas House, Annette Strauss, Mayor of Dallas for a few years. So Jews have been able to integrate, for the most part, very well into Texas life and into Southern life and their presence at some of the highest levels of political leadership is a testament to that. Probably the most famous, almost Texas Jewish politician is Kinky Friedman. Those of you who are familiar with Kinky, he's definitely a local legend here in Houston and in Texas. He is a musician, a novelist, and has run for governor unsuccessfully a couple times, but this has not stopped him from trying, and he may try yet again. Who knows? Let me just step out of my presentation again and see there's a new comment in the chat window. Wow, lots of connections to Beth Yeshurun. Fascinating. That's really great. Okay, keep the questions and comments coming. I am going to try to stop in about 10 or 15 minutes so that we'll have some time to sort of open it up for comments and questions that way. Another important idea in Southern Jewish history that resonates, I'm sure, both in Texas and in North Carolina, is the primacy of interfaith relations, which, if you're living in the Bible Belt, in a region that is deeply suffused with Christian culture and beliefs, it's important to try to establish good interfaith relations. And this was done here in Houston and across the country through something called Brotherhood Week. And I don't know if any of you remember Brotherhood Week from growing up. There's a kind of famous, funny song by Tom Lehrer about Brotherhood Week. But it was a week in February dedicated to the promotion of interfaith tolerance and mutual understanding. And here in Houston, what would happen would be that ministers would come speak in synagogues and temples, usually on a Friday night. Rabbis would be invited to preach in churches on Sunday mornings. And the themes, right, usually resonated around some idea of the commonalities that Jews and Christians and all human beings share. So this is something that happens less today, but for many, many decades in Texas was a very prominent theme. And along with that is the idea of the Texas rabbi as an emissary to the Christian community, as a kind of representative of the local Jewish community and of Judaism to the wider Christian public. And this is certainly a role that rabbis historically have played in Texas, whether we're talking about Rabbi Henry Cohen, probably the most famous rabbi in Texas history, who lived and preached in Galveston for many, many, many decades, as well as rabbis in small towns like Wharton, who could be called upon to speak out against the Klan or speak out against anti-Semitism, to make appearances on local radio and television shows when the holidays were approaching, to help non-Jews gain an appreciation for all that Judaism and Christianity have in common, and even perhaps things that they don't. Another theme that feels particularly powerful and resonant in our own day and time is the place of Jews in Texas and in the wider South as people who came to be accepted as white, but also people who historically have had a special sensitivity to the plight of Black Americans. And to some extent, this is reflected in civil rights activism. We should not presume that all Jews living in the South supported civil rights. The actual story is much more complicated and nuanced than that. But there are certain heroes, certain people who did stand up and speak out, and who are not as well known as folks like Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and others. So Houston's Rabbi Moshe Kahana, for example, was among the Jewish clergy who marched on behalf of African-American voting rights in Selma, Alabama in March of 1965. and he remains less well known than some of his contemporaries. There were also efforts to promote integration and to resist white flight that took place here in Houston. And we can talk more about that another time. This is a lawn sign that once hung in an integrated neighborhood that whites and Jews were starting to leave as blacks were moving in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And there's another side to this as well, which is that while some Jews supported the civil rights movement and were present at marches, some of the earliest sit-ins that took place in Houston took place at Jewish-owned department stores and lunch counters. And so some Jewish Houstonians found themselves unwittingly at the forefront of desegregation efforts and were among the first to be confronted with the need to address the problems that these sit-ins provoked. So it's a really interesting and complicated subject, the place of Jews in Texas and the South in the civil rights movement and in relation to Black Americans. And I'm very glad to hear that your congregation is going to be learning more about this topic and thinking about how to address it thoughtfully. One of the last themes that I want to talk about with you today that applies not only to Texas Jewish history, but to Southern Jewish history is this really interesting dichotomy that has taken place in the last couple of decades. And what I mean by dichotomy here is a split between what I would call the Old South and the New South. So by the Old South, what I mean is the presence of Jewish families dating back to the early and mid 19th century in small towns all across the Southern United States, where immigrant families came and established a general store, clothing store, maybe a tailor shop. Maybe they became prominent in the scrap business or the recycling business. And they found economic opportunities in small towns. Maybe they were near a railroad hub or near a body of water. And these small town Jewish communities usually persist for about 2 or 3 generations. But at a certain point, usually beginning in like the 50s and 60s, the younger generation goes off to college and doesn't come back to take over the store or the family business. And so you begin to see the steady decline of Jewish communities in small towns like Victoria and Wharton, Texas. And many of these communities today, if they haven't disappeared entirely, are sort of barely hanging on. Concurrently, in the last couple decades, one of the other demographic trends that's happening is that people are leaving the East Coast and the Midwest, and to some extent the West Coast, where the weather is cold, state taxes are high, and leaving for destinations in the Sun Belt and in the South. And so we're seeing remarkable growth in Jewish communities in Texas. And I would feel pretty comfortable in guessing that Charlotte has also benefited from this. And so you have a kind of Jewish New South that has been bolstered by recent arrivals in the last couple decades, whether it's folks seeking out warmer climate or seeking out a higher quality of life, and moving to destinations that may not have been attractive to American Jewish families a few decades ago. But we're seeing a resurgence in places like Houston and Dallas, like Charleston, and I would venture to say Charlotte as well. So decline in the smaller small town communities, but also a lot of really interesting growth in these southern metropolises as well. And here you can kind of see some Jewish population estimates, recent figures about how Jewish communities here have been growing in recent decades, but perhaps not as much as you might expect, given that Texas is so large and Houston is the 4th largest city in the United States, but its Jewish community still does not reflect that. So by way of concluding my prepared remarks, I think it's interesting to reflect on the special place of Texas Jews in the spectrum of Western Jewish history, Southern Jewish history, et cetera, et cetera. So what makes Texas stand out? Again, I think there are some parallels to the experience in Florida. And so Texas and Florida have a lot in common here. But the presence of a vital subgroup of Spanish-speaking Jews in Texas Jewish communities today really does make our experience, I think, unique from some of the other states in the South. The fact that you can go into a synagogue and depending on where you are, which community you're in, right, hear Spanish being spoken in the building is because of people immigrating from Mexico and from South America, right? That kind of gives Texas Jewry a bit of a different flavor. Texas has also benefited from a large migration of Jews from South Africa in the 1970s and 1980s. And there is still today a significant South African Jewish community in places like Houston and Dallas and San Antonio for many interesting reasons. And then just two last, concluding points. One is that in my experience, having lived on the East Coast for a long time and having lived in the Midwest for a bit, that Zionism seems to me to be more central to Jewish identity in Texas than it is in Jewish communities on the coasts. And it's interesting to think about why that is. Is it because of, Texas being the Lone Star State and having kind of an independent streak, or Texas Jews being more politically conservative than Jews on the coast? But it seems to me that at least here in Texas, right, support for Zionism in the state of Israel is much more of a common ground and a meeting place for Jews of different ideological backgrounds than it is perhaps in other Jewish communities. And then finally, there's just something that, you can't quite put your finger on it, but there is a kind of Texas mystique, right? A legend, a myth, a pervasive feeling that Texas is a whole other country, unlike any other place on earth, that Texans and Texan Jews are, we are a breed unto ourselves, and you can't tell us otherwise. Don't bother us with facts. We are special, we are unique, and there's nobody else like us. So these are my reflections about the Texas Jewish experience. I'm happy to hear about what you all think, what themes resonated with you, and what similarities you have found. And then at the very end, I'll share my contact information for those of you who'd like to learn more about the broader scope of my work. So, okay, there was a question from Stefan. This is an interesting question about Rice University. So he writes, would you mention of integration of Rice University that did not accept Jews till the 1950s? So Stefan is not correct in the sense that Rice was closed to Jews. So Rice was never closed to Jewish students. As a matter of fact, there were Jewish students in the inaugural class of the Rice Institute, and the very first student to graduate with honors from Rice was a Jewish student. However, having said that, Rice, not unlike other elite institutions of higher learning in the United States, did place some limitations on accepting Jewish students. And for a time in the 1930s and 1940s, did not admit Jews into its engineering program. So you could, if you identified as Jewish, or if you had a Jewish sounding name, they would admit you to Rice to study other fields, but they wouldn't admit you to engineering. And the reason given in the files was that they didn't think they could place you in a job after graduation with an engineering firm. So why waste a spot on a Jewish kid that's not going to get hired by an engineering firm? This policy, which was never written down, was uncovered and brought before the Board of Trustees and overturned. So Rice never officially banned Jews from attending, but there is a little bit of a complicated history in Rice's past with welcoming Jewish students fully. Other comments or questions from the group? Feel free either to.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Was there a difference in the Jewish demographics of the people who entered the port of Galveston, say, versus Ellis Island?
Okay, interesting question. So Harry wants to know about the demographics of the Jews who came through Galveston versus those who went to Ellis Island. I think in one sense, yes. So the effort to bring Jews in through Galveston intentionally, which was a project with a definitive starting date and ending date between 1907 and 1914. There was a project known as the Galveston movement. And the idea was to bring Eastern European Jews to the United States to rescue them, but not to bring them to Ellis Island and not to let them settle in the crowded ghettos of the Lower East Side. Why? Because number one, the American Jewish leaders wanted immigrants to learn English, to assimilate, and they feared that if they went to the Lower East Side, where they could easily just keep speaking Yiddish and keep attending Orthodox synagogues and keep, participating in that kind of familiar traditional Jewish life, or attending socialist Jewish socialist meeting halls and lectures also, that they would not become good Americans. And so the idea was to send them through Galveston into Middle America, into places with smaller Jewish communities, so that they would have to learn English and that they would have to assimilate and adapt to American life more quickly. And so the candidates that they recruited for this particular project were not, at least outwardly, religiously observant. Because the idea was, to send you right to Greeley, Colorado, or Des Moines, Iowa, or perhaps, to a place like Kansas City, Missouri. And some Jews did end up staying in Texas, in Galveston or Houston or Fort Worth or places like that. But the main distinction, Harry, would be that the candidates that they tried to bring in through Galveston in this period were neither super religious, so they were comfortable working on Saturdays or, comfortable going to a place where it would be hard to find kosher food. Whereas Ellis Island, right, there were no such, restrictions or qualifying criteria placed on the people who chose to emigrate through Ellis Island. That, I think, to me, would be the primary difference. Okay, a couple more questions.
Yeah, so based on that, what you just said, then was there a drop off of Jewish membership overall as they became so assimilated that they actually stopped being Jewish? That there was less?
So that's an interesting question, Judy, and unfortunately, it's very hard to quantify, because the people who kept, and there were people who kept immaculate statistics about where the immigrants who came through Galveston went, with a ship that they came on, the job skills that they claimed to have, but they didn't keep track of things like synagogue membership or Hadassah chapter affiliation, or because they weren't, quite frankly, interested in that. They were interested in saving these people, getting them out of Europe, and finding them a job, finding them a livelihood in the United States. The extent to which they joined a synagogue or joined a B'nai B'rith Lodge, those were not the questions that mattered to the organizers of this particular immigration project. Now, having said that, there are scholars and individuals who are interested in asking about the Jewishness of the Galveston movement immigrants and their descendants. So when you send somebody to a place like, Bowman, North Dakota, what does that do to somebody's Jewish identity? Right? Unless the people who go there write about it or leave behind some kind of historical record, they slip through the cracks, many of them, unfortunately.
I would think they just became so assimilated, and that's been my experience when I was in Memphis for a long time, which is southern, but that the Jews that grew up in these small cities in Mississippi and Alabama and all that, they didn't even practice Judaism.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
and what does it mean to be Jewish? I mean, that's a whole other story.
Yeah, right. So then we start to get into some pretty thorny questions about, well, what does it mean to be Jewish and who gets to decide? And, we start placing value judgments on people. Let's also, let's not forget that, in 2021, I can wear a yarmulke and walk into a grocery store and shop for kosher food and probably feel more comfortable and secure in doing so than my grandfather did or would have felt 60 years ago, right? I mean, to be and not even just an observant Jew, but just an outwardly affiliated Jew in today's moment. And I recognize that I'm saying this, at a time when, we have seen, the anti-Semitism on the rise and white supremacists emboldened and, marching in the streets of Charlottesville with torches. And I'm certainly mindful of all of that. Right. But it was a different, it was a different era that those folks came to America, and it was a different America. It was less tolerant of diversity of ethnicity and diversity of religious practice. Okay, we have time for maybe one more comment or question.
Hello, Bob Larrick. And regarding Zionism and Temple Bethel being one of the leaders in interfaith, can we work together for greater understanding of the right of Jews for self-determination rights in the Middle East also on interfaith and Abrahamic orientation, which is something that Vanderbilt University is doing, not that exactly, but the idea of unity, and doesn't America and also need a more universal understanding and support for Israel's right to exist without being an evil empire?
Yeah, thank you for that comment and question. And I think all of us, across the political spectrum are watching the news and with heavy hearts and just hoping that we can come to a place where peace and coexistence will feel possible again. And obviously a lot of things will have to happen to get us back on that road. But certainly mindful of the cycle of violence that is taking place over there, and it is taking a deep toll on everyone in the region. Nobody is free from the trauma that this latest round of bombings is unleashing. I want to end with, there was just a comment in the chat window from Stefan. Thank you, Stefan, for your very energetic use of the chat window. Were there Jews that became farmers or ranchers? The answer is yes. Not many, but yes. There were individual Jews that did go into the ranching business. And there were, just as we talked today about the Galveston movement, there were other projects in the first decades of the 20th century, at a time when, clearly life in Europe for Jews was an unfolding disaster. And, any kind of plan or project or program to get Jews out of Europe by any means necessary was being bandied about and considered. And there were some attempts at establishing Jewish farming colonies in the United States. They were not super successful for reasons that we don't have a lot of time to discuss, but they did try. They did try, and if you Google, do some Google work on Jewish agricultural colonies, you'll find some interesting results. And of course, in Palestine and then Israel, right, the whole kibbutz movement is part of that same phenomenon. All right, this is going to end our time together today. I want to thank you all for your patience and your participation, and for the opportunity to be with you. And perhaps we'll be able to do this again in the future on another topic. I wish you all well, be healthy, be safe, have a good summer, and continue learning.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So much. We really appreciate that, and wonderful. And Natalie, we're going to bust up now. So enjoy your local groups, and hopefully we'll see you all in person at some point in the near future.
Folks, I put my email address in the chat window. So if you'd like to correspond with me, you can do that. And I'll also send the website for the archive to Harry. Take care, everybody.
Hey, Tracy, I've got to go meet Carolina Sound, so I'm going to just turn off my video and let them do. Oh, wait, let me move this guy to 4. So there's at least 4 or 5 people in every room. All right. Thank you. I can't hear you. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm gonna head in.
Okay, great. See you then.
Okay.
Thanks.